Imagine a hand. Not a hand holding a weapon or a tool or anything you would recognize. Just a hand. Pressed flat against a wall of stone, deep inside a cave in what is now southern France. While another hand directed a mouthful of red pigment around it, leaving the shape of the first hand in negative against the rock. That handprint is still there. It has been there for somewhere between 25,000 and 35,000 years. The person who made it stood in that cave, in that darkness, and decided that something about the fact of their own existence was worth recording. We do not know their name. We do not know what language they spoke, or what they believed, or what kind of life surrounded that single gesture. We do not know whether they came back to look at it afterward, or whether they showed it to someone else, or whether they understood that it would still be there, thousands of generations after every person they had ever known was gone. We know the hand. That is all we know. And yet, that hand was pressed against that wall by someone who woke up that morning, who had things on their mind, who was loved by someone and who loved someone in return, who had opinions and fears and a particular way of seeing the world that belonged entirely to them and has been completely, permanently lost. The hand is what remains of all of that. A shape in pigment on a cave wall. Tonight we are going to spend some time in the company of that kind of loss. Not with comfortable answers, because there are none, but with the honest weight of how much was real, and how much is gone, and what it means that so many millions of human lives passed through this world and left almost nothing behind that we can read. You do not need to hold on tightly. If you drift somewhere in the middle, that is perfectly fine. The people we are talking about have been waiting a very long time. They can wait a little longer. Chapter 1. The Problem with Silence. There is a line in human history that most people never think about. It runs across the record somewhere around 5,000 years ago. And everything on one side of it is different, in a fundamental way, from everything on the other side. Not better or worse. Not more or less human. Different in a way that changes what we can ever hope to know. On one side of that line, people left records. A clay tablet with marks that carried meaning. A name pressed into wet stone above a doorway. A list of goods exchanged between two parties who wanted the exchange remembered. Something that carried human intention forward through time in a form that other human beings, thousands of years later, could attempt to decode. On the other side of that line, there is silence. Not the silence of nothing happening. The silence of everything happening and none of it surviving in any form we can read. The word prehistory is the word we use for that silence. It is a practical term, a useful dividing line, but it carries an implication worth examining carefully. Because prehistory does not mean before people had history. It means before people had our kind of history. The written kind. The kind that gets copied and translated and argued over and eventually ends up in a classroom. The people who lived before that line had history in every meaningful sense. They had events that changed everything. They had leaders whose decisions shaped thousands of lives. They had disasters and recoveries and migrations and discoveries. They had, almost certainly, a deep and sophisticated understanding of their own past, maintained through oral traditions and ritual practice and the careful transmission of hard-won knowledge from elder to apprentice, year after year, generation after generation. We simply cannot access most of it, and this is the first thing that needs to be said clearly, because it shapes everything that follows tonight. The absence of a written record is not evidence that nothing was there. This seems obvious when you say it directly. But the way history gets taught, the way it gets represented in museums and documentaries, and the stories a culture tells about itself, tends to quietly assume that what we know is roughly equivalent to what happened, that the civilizations we can read about were the important ones, that the people who left records were the ones worth remembering. That assumption is almost certainly wrong. Consider the numbers honestly. Modern humans, people biologically identical to you and to everyone you have ever met, have been on this planet for somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years, depending on which fossil evidence you weight most heavily. Writing, in its earliest recognizable forms, appears in the archaeological record no earlier than around 5,000 years ago. That means that for somewhere between 95 and 98% of the entire span of modern human existence, the things people did, built, believed, discovered, created, and mourned left no written trace at all, 95 to 98%. If you compress the entire history of modern humans into a single calendar year, writing would appear sometime on the morning of December 31st. Everything before that, all of January through December 30th, plus almost all of December 31st, is what we are talking about tonight. The part with no names, the part with no records that we can read, and yet the silence is not empty. This is the paradox at the center of everything we are going to explore. The silence is full of people who were as completely and urgently alive as you are right now, in whatever room or bed or quiet place you have found for yourself tonight. People who woke up in the morning with things on their minds, who laughed at things, who grieved things, who understood their world with a depth and sophistication that the absence of their written record makes it far too easy for us to underestimate. Archaeology can recover some of what they left behind. The physical objects, the structures, the bones, the residue of meals and fires, ancient DNA, extracted from teeth and dense cortical bone, can now trace population movements across thousands of years with a precision that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. But there is a category of thing that no technology will ever recover. What they thought, what they believed about the world they lived in, what they feared, what stories they told their children, what words they used for love or grief, or the specific feeling of watching someone you know walk away for the last time. Those things required language to survive. Language required some technology of preservation to outlast the people who spoke it. Before that technology existed, language vanished with the last person who carried it. Every word, every story, every name. Before 3000 BC, there were almost certainly thousands of distinct languages spoken across the inhabited world. Languages with their own grammatical structures, their own poetic traditions, their own ways of organizing how a person experienced being alive. The overwhelming majority of those languages are not merely undocumented. They are gone in a way that leaves no trace. Because no writing system existed to record even a single word. We do not know how many. We cannot reconstruct them. They are silent in a way that is absolute and final. But the people who spoke them were not silent to each other. They talked, constantly, probably, about the weather and the hunting and the people they loved and the things that had happened and the things they were afraid of. They argued and laughed and told stories that seemed very important in the moment and have been completely, irreversibly lost. The question this night is asking is not what those people built, or where they lived, or when they died. Those questions matter, and we will spend time with them. The deeper question is what it means that so much human experience has passed through the world without leaving any recoverable trace. What it means for how we understand ourselves, and where we come from, and how fragile the things we think of as permanent actually are. Those are not comfortable questions, but they are the right ones to be sitting with as you let your breathing slow. The past is not empty. It is full of people, and some of what they left behind, in stone and bone, and the faint chemical traces preserved in ancient soil, is slowly being found by researchers who understand that every fragment matters. We are going to spend this night with some of those fragments. Not with easy answers, not with complete stories, but with the honest weight of what we do not know, and with the people who lived inside that silence as completely as you are living inside this moment right now. Close your eyes if they want to close. The story will carry you. Chapter 2. The Architects, Nobody Named. There is a hill in southeastern Turkey that should not exist the way it exists. From a distance it looks like any other hill in the Harran Plain. A limestone landscape of dry scrub and scattered rock that gives little indication of anything remarkable beneath it. Farmers worked around it for generations. A survey team in the 1960s noted it briefly. Described it as a medieval cemetery of no particular significance, and moved on. Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt looked at the same hill and understood that something was wrong with that assessment. The stones visible on the surface were not medieval. Schmidt began to die. What emerged from that hill over the following years has quietly changed what we thought we knew about the beginning of human civilization. Beneath that hill, arranged in a series of circular and oval enclosures, are massive T-shaped limestone pillars. Some stand up to 20 feet tall. Some weigh between 7 and 10 tons. They are carved with images of animals rendered with a naturalistic precision that is genuinely striking even to a modern eye. Snakes and foxes and vultures and scorpions and wild boars, depicted with the kind of careful observation that comes from years of watching real animals move through a real landscape. Some of the pillars bear carved arms and hands in relief, suggesting they may represent stylized human figures, possibly ancestors, possibly something that does not fit any category we currently use. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. It predates Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years. It predates the Great Pyramid by more than 7,000 years. And the people who built it, based on the evidence available when Schmidt began excavating, had not yet developed agriculture, had not yet domesticated animals, had not yet made pottery. Hunter-gatherers built this. That sentence still carries the weight of genuine surprise for researchers who study this period. Because everything the older models of human development assumed said it should not have been possible. The conventional understanding held that complexity came after agriculture. You had to settle down, produce a food surplus, develop specialized labor, before you could organize the collective effort that a project of this scale required. Göbekli Tepe appeared to say the opposite. That the belief system, the need to build something like this, may have come before the economic conditions that were supposed to make it possible. And that agriculture, the deliberate cultivation of wild grains in the surrounding region, may have developed partly in response to the need to feed the people doing the building. Recent excavations have added further layers to this picture. Researchers have found grinding stones, flint sickles, and plant residues at the site, suggesting its builders may have been in the process of transitioning toward agriculture rather than being purely pre-agricultural. A water supply system, carved channels, feeding cisterns in the bedrock capable of holding substantial quantities of rainwater, suggests periods of sustained occupation. Early reports from around 2025 suggested the possible discovery of a life-sized human statue embedded in the base of a wall. Apparently, as a deliberate offering, though full details of this find are still being documented and assessed by the research team. As of the most recent estimates, no more than 5 to 10% of the site has been excavated. Geophysical surveys indicate at least 15 additional enclosures still buried underground. Researchers estimate it may take 150 years to fully explore what is there. 150 years. The scientists of the 22nd century will still be finding new things in this hill. But the question that more excavation will not answer is the one worth sitting with tonight. What did it mean to the people who built it? We know the dimensions of the pillars. We know the species of animals carved on them with enough precision that zoologists can identify which specific snakes and foxes were being depicted. We know that certain enclosures appear to have possible alignments with celestial events, though researchers note these require further study before their intentionality can be confirmed. We know the site was eventually deliberately backfilled, the enclosures carefully buried under tons of debris in a process that itself appears to have been intentional. What we do not know is the name of a single person involved in any of this. Not one. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they called this place. We do not know what words they used for the figures on the pillars, or what those figures meant to someone standing in an enclosure at a specific time of year, in the specific quality of light that fell through whatever opening existed above. We know they believed something strongly enough to move 10-ton stones up a hill and carve them with extraordinary care. We do not know what that something was. Göbekli Tepe is not alone. On the island of Malta, in the central Mediterranean, there are stone temples that stand among the oldest freestanding structures on Earth. The Gantija temples on the island of Gozo were constructed around 3600 BC, built from massive limestone blocks, some weighing over 50 tons, fitted together with a precision that continues to impress structural engineers. The people who built them left behind carved stone figures and evidence of ritual feasting and fire. And then, around 2500 BC, they were gone. Not gradually, relatively abruptly. The temples were abandoned. The tradition ended. A different population, with different material culture, appears in the archaeological record shortly after. What happened is not known. Whether disease or climate stress or conflict or something that left no clear physical evidence. The record does not say. Off the northern coast of Scotland, on the Orkney Islands, a Neolithic village called Skara Brae was occupied from around 3100 BC to around 2500 BC, roughly contemporary with the early Egyptian dynasties. It was preserved under a sand dune for thousands of years until a storm in 1850 revealed it. What the storm uncovered was extraordinary. Stone furniture still in place. Stone beds. Stone shelves. Stone dressers standing against the walls of each house. Passageways connecting the dwellings. Drains built into the floors. These were permanent homes, carefully built and maintained, belonging to people who clearly expected to be there for a long time and who arranged their domestic space with attention to comfort and order. The shelves are still there. Whatever was on them is gone. This is the pattern across the entire prehistoric world. Structures that required enormous collective effort, that clearly reflected sophisticated beliefs and significant social organization, built by people who left no name, no language, no recoverable account of their own existence. They were not anonymous to themselves. Every person who shaped a stone at Göbekli Tepe had a name that mattered to someone. Every family that slept in those stone-furnished beds at Skara Brae knew exactly who they were. The anonymity is ours, not theirs. We are the ones who lost the names. And what the stones tell us, if we are willing to sit with the question long enough, is not that these people were simple or that their inner lives were thin. The stones tell us that they had something to say that they believed was important enough to say in the most permanent medium available to them. We just cannot read it anymore. We can see the intention. We can measure the effort. We can stand where they stood and look at what they made. But the meaning itself, what it felt like to be inside one of those enclosures at a specific moment for a specific purpose, that is gone. And the going of it is one of the quieter losses in the long catalog of things that time has taken from us. The architects are gone. The stones are still here. And somewhere in the relationship between those two facts is something worth understanding about what human beings have always needed to do with the time they are given. Let that settle as you breathe. The hill in Turkey is still there tonight, still holding what it holds, patient in the way that only very old things know how to be. Chapter 3. The Green Sahara and the People Who Moved Toward the Nile. If you could stand in what is now the Central Sahara Desert, in what is now southern Algeria or northern Niger, and if you could be standing there, not today but somewhere roughly between 9,000 and 11,000 years ago, you would not recognize what you were seeing. you would be standing in grassland. Not sparse scrubland at the edge of survivability. Genuine grassland with lakes and rivers and trees and animals. Elephants and hippopotamuses lived in what is now one of the driest places on Earth. Cattle were being herded across landscapes that today receive almost no rainfall at all. Fish were being caught in lakes that have not held water in thousands of years. This period is known in the scientific literature as the African Humid Period, and sometimes informally as the Green Sahara. It lasted, roughly, from around 11,000 BC to around 3000 BC, though the timing varied considerably across different parts of the region. It was driven primarily by shifts in Earth's orbital patterns that altered the distribution of monsoon rainfall across North Africa. During this period, the Sahara was not the barrier between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world that it is today. It was a bridge, a vast, inhabited, ecologically rich bridge across which people and animals and ideas could move. The evidence for this comes from multiple directions. Cave paintings in the Tassili Niger Plateau in what is now southeastern Algeria show scenes of cattle herding, hunting, swimming, and daily life, painted in styles that evolved over thousands of years as the people making them and the world around them changed. Some of these paintings are among the most accomplished examples of prehistoric art anywhere in the world, depicting human figures with a naturalism and a sense of movement and narrative that suggests their makers had been developing this tradition across many generations. Fossil pollen extracted from ancient lake sediments confirms the presence of tree species and grasses that require significantly more rainfall than the area currently receives. Bones of hippos and crocodiles and large fish have been recovered from sites now hundreds of kilometers from any permanent water source. And then there is Nabta Playa. Nabta Playa is a dried lake bed in the Nubian desert, approximately 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, in what is now southern Egypt, around 5000 BC, and possibly earlier. Pastoral peoples who used this location as a seasonal gathering place arranged large stones in patterns that researchers, including Wendorf and Schild, have analyzed as possible astronomical alignments, including what may be a calendar circle oriented toward the summer solstice. The precise interpretation of these alignments remains a subject of scholarly discussion. Confirming deliberate astronomical intent in stone arrangements requires careful analysis beyond orientation alone. But the general picture that emerges is of a people organized enough to return to the same location across generations, purposeful enough to arrange substantial stones according to some shared plan, and observant enough to track the movements of the sky across long periods of time. These were not the Egyptians. The civilization we recognize as Egypt would not emerge for another 2,000 years or more. These were Saharan pastoralists, cattle herders living in a landscape that no longer exists. What happened to them? The African Humid Period ended, not all at once, but in pulses, with the most severe drying occurring between approximately 5000 and 3000 BC. The lakes shrank, the rivers narrowed and then dried. The grasslands contracted toward the remaining water sources. The animals moved or died, and the people had to go somewhere. The most significant remaining water source in the region was the Nile. What the available evidence appears to suggest, and it is important to hold this as a reasonable inference rather than a confirmed conclusion, is that the drying Sahara may have contributed to population movements toward the Nile Valley during this period. Climate data from the relevant centuries aligns with evidence of increased activity in the Egyptian Nile region. Ancient DNA studies of pre-dynastic Egyptian populations show evidence of multiple population origins, consistent with the idea of people arriving from different directions. Though the specific contribution of Saharan populations relative to other groups remains a subject of ongoing research. Some researchers have proposed that this kind of forced convergence, multiple populations with different skills and different accumulated knowledge crowding into the same narrow valley, may have contributed to the conditions that eventually produced what we recognize as Egyptian civilization. The relatively rapid consolidation of early Egyptian state structures is one of the puzzles of ancient history. And population convergence from regions like the Green Sahara is among the hypotheses researchers have explored. These interpretations are suggestive. They are not settled conclusions. But imagine, for a moment, what those Saharan pastoralists carried with them as they moved toward the Nile. Not just their cattle and their tools, their knowledge. The centuries of accumulated understanding of how to read the sky. How to track seasonal change. How to organize communities across vast landscapes. The specific way of seeing the world that only their language could express. All of that moved toward the river. And then the language was gone. And the people who spoke it were absorbed into something larger. And what they knew lived on. If it lived on at all. In the practices and the structures and the ways of organizing communal life that eventually produced the civilization we remember. Or it did not live on. We do not know which. What is not in dispute is the scale of what the drying Sahara erased. The people who painted those cattle herders on the walls of Tassili N'Ajjer developed their artistic tradition over thousands of years. They accumulated detailed knowledge of the plants and animals of their environment. They had social structures complex enough to organize the repeated use of specific sites across generations. They had ritual practices, important enough to record in paint, on stone. None of their names survive. None of their languages can be reconstructed from available evidence. Their cattle are gone. Their lakes are gone. Their grasslands are gone. What remains are the paintings on the cave walls and the stone arrangements in the dried lake beds. And one more detail worth holding before we leave them. The rock paintings of the Tassili N'Ajjer are deteriorating, exposed to the elements and to the presence of visitors over recent decades. Some paintings that survived for 8,000 years are fading now, faster than at any point in their history. There are efforts underway to document them photographically, to preserve in digital form what is still readable in pigment. But the paintings were always the smallest edge of what those people knew and felt and believed. They painted what mattered enough to paint, the things that mattered too deeply to paint, or that seemed too fundamental to daily life to require recording. Those things are gone, in a way that no documentation project will recover. The people who painted them watched their world change. They moved toward the one remaining water on the horizon, and what they carried with them, in memory and in practice, and in the way they understood how the world worked. We can only hold as a question, not answer it. Hold it. Because the question itself is worth something. Let your breathing find its own rhythm now. The desert is still there tonight, still holding what it holds beneath all that sand. And somewhere beneath it, things are waiting to be found that will change what we think we know about where some of us came from. Chapter 4. Doggerland. The country that drowned. There is a country at the bottom of the North Sea. Not a metaphor, not a legend. A real country. With real rivers and real hills and real coastlines, where real people built fires and raised children and buried their dead. A country roughly the size of modern Britain. A country that connected what is now the British Isles to what is now mainland Europe in a continuous landscape of marshes and wooded valleys and slow-moving rivers and shallow lakes. That country is gone now. The sea took it. We call it Doggerland, named for Doggerbank, a shallow, submerged sandbank in the central North Sea that fishing boats have worked for centuries. The name was coined in the late 1990s by archaeologist Brian Coles of the University of Exeter, who was among the first researchers to describe the drowned landscape systematically and think carefully about what its existence meant for our understanding of prehistoric Europe. The story begins at the end of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, when sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than they are today. The water locked in the great ice sheets of the north had to go somewhere when the climate warmed. and it went into the oceans. Slowly and relentlessly, raising sea levels over thousands of years. What had been dry land became shallow sea. Coastlines retreated. Rivers that had flowed across broad plains found their mouths moving steadily inland. For the Mesolithic peoples of northwestern Europe, Doggerland was not a land bridge they crossed to get somewhere else. It was home, one of the richest hunter-gatherer landscapes on Earth, a mosaic of habitats that provided an extraordinary diversity of food. Red deer and aurochs on the higher ground, waterfowl and fish in the marshes and rivers. Hazelnuts, collected in enormous quantities and stored for winter, in the forests. The evidence suggests a landscape so abundant that communities could sustain themselves with a degree of stability that we sometimes underestimate in hunter-gatherer life. The people archaeologists call the Maglemotians, active roughly from 9,000 to 6,000 BC, were among the main inhabitants of this world. They made small, precise flint tools set into wooden hafts. They worked bone and antler into barbed points that still surface occasionally in trawler nets dragged across the North Sea floor. They built dugout canoes. They wove fish traps from willow. They followed the seasonal movements of animals across a landscape that is now underwater. In 2019, a research team sampling the seabed about 25 miles off the coast of Norfolk recovered a hammerstone flint from a depth of 32 meters. A simple tool, used to strike flakes from other stones. It belonged to a person who was standing on dry land when they used it or set it down and walked away. That person walked across a landscape that no longer exists. The tool waited for them for thousands of years. Nobody came back. Since 2015, the University of Bradford's Submerged Landscapes Research Center, led by Professor Vince Gaffney, has mapped approximately 188,000 square kilometers of the North Sea floor using seismic data gathered largely by energy companies drilling for oil and gas. From that data, the team has reconstructed ancient river channels, coastlines, estuaries, and hillsides. They have traced the path of a drowned river they call the Outer Silver Pit, a waterway that once flowed across the central plain of Doggerland for hundreds of kilometers. They have identified salt marshes and freshwater lakes. They have produced maps showing Doggerland's gradual transformation from a vast continental plain to a shrinking archipelago to nothing. Sedimentary DNA research published in 2026 by scientists at the University of Warwick found that temperate woodland species, oak, elm, and hazel, were already growing in southern Doggerland more than 16,000 years ago. Thousands of years earlier than these species appear in the mainland British record. The landscape was not barren. It was forested, complex, and alive long before the drowning began. The drowning was slow at first. For thousands of years, sea levels rose at an average rate of roughly 6 feet per century, enough that a coastal settlement built by a grandfather could be threatened by flooding before his grandchildren were grown. Fishing grounds changed. Hunting routes flooded. Generation after generation of Doggerland's people watched their homeland shrink. Think about what that experience was. Not a disaster that arrived in a day. Not a flood story with a beginning and an end. A loss that stretched across lifetimes. That was still happening when you were born and would still be happening when you died. And that had been happening for longer than anyone could remember. A homeland that was smaller every decade. Familiar places that became shallow water. The names of places that no longer existed, kept alive in the stories old people told about where they had been as children. This is not metaphor. This is what the evidence describes. And then, around 6,200 BC, something changed the pace entirely. Off the coast of Norway, at the edge of the continental shelf, an enormous mass of seafloor sediment, covering approximately 3,000 cubic kilometers, suddenly gave way and slid into the deep ocean. The event is known as the Storegga Slide, one of the largest underwater landslides documented from the entire Holocene period. It generated a tsunami. The waves that spread out from that collapse have been reconstructed by researchers using geological deposits found at coastal locations around the North Sea. Sediment layers from the tsunami have been identified on the eastern coast of Scotland, where waves appear to have reached heights of at least 20 meters in some locations. Similar deposits have been found in the Faroe Islands and along the Norwegian coast. The wave penetrated up to 40 kilometers inland in some areas. Any Doggerland communities living on the low-lying plains of the central landscape that day had no warning. No high ground nearby. No escape that the speed of the wave would have allowed. Whatever was there was gone. And yet a 2020 study by British and Estonian scientists found evidence that some of Doggerland's higher ground, particularly the area now called Dogger Bank, survived the tsunami as small islands. Perhaps a quarter of the population was killed in the Storegga event. The researchers estimated. But a remnant endured. The last islands of Doggerland lingered for another 1,000 years, shrinking slowly as sea levels continued to rise. By 5000 BC, Dogger Bank itself was gone. The sea closed over the last of it. The North Sea has been patient about releasing what it holds. Trawler nets have been bringing up artifacts for more than a century. Bone harpoon points, fragments of dugout canoes, fish traps woven from split willow rods, preserved almost perfectly by cold. Oxygen poor mud, human footprints preserved in compressed clay, with as many as 39 consecutive prints in a single track, revealing the gait and pace of someone who walked across wet mud thousands of years ago and left a signature that the sea kept intact for all the time since. A fragment of human skull dated to approximately 13,000 years before the present. A Neanderthal skull fragment, pushing the region's human occupation back 40,000 years. The sea keeps what it takes. Dutch researchers working off the Netherlands coast have given a name to the submerged river banks where artifact concentrations are highest. They call them donken. The spines, the edges of drowned landforms where Mesolithic people camped because the rivers provided water and the elevated banks provided sightlines across the surrounding terrain. The people who camped on those banks watched the water rise around them. They adapted, as people do, for as long as adaptation was possible. And then they left, or they died, or they were absorbed into the communities on the remaining dry land to the east and north and west. And what they knew about the country that was drowning. The names of the rivers that no longer ran. The locations of the fishing places now under fathoms of water. The stories about where their grandparents had lived. All of that became memory. And then the memory became stories told less and less often. And then the stories faded into something wordless, carried in the body rather than in the mouth. In the particular way, certain people looked at the sea. Whether any echo of Doggerland survives in the much later oral traditions of the Celtic and Germanic peoples, in the persistent legends of drowned lands that appear in Welsh and Breton mythology, is a question scholars approach with considerable caution. The chain of transmission across 8,000 years is too long and too broken to allow confident conclusions. What can be said is that the experience of watching a homeland disappear beneath the sea was real, and that experiences of that magnitude tend to leave marks on how communities understand themselves, even when the specific memory of the event is long gone. The hammerstone is in a laboratory now, sitting on a shelf somewhere. The hand that shaped it is gone. But the intention in the shaping, the care with which someone selected that particular stone and worked it into the form that made it useful, that is still visible to anyone who looks carefully enough. Let your breathing slow. The sea is patient. It keeps what it takes for a very long time. And what it kept of Doggerland is slowly, carefully being brought back to the surface by people who understand that a country at the bottom of the North Sea is still a country, And the people who lived there were still people, worth remembering, even without their names. Chapter 5. The first cities nobody remembers. There is a word that carries more weight than it looks like it should. The word is city. When most people think of the first cities, they think of Mesopotamia, of Ur and Uruk and the flat plains of what is now southern Iraq, where the first recognizable urban settlements appear in the archaeological record, around 5,500 BC. These are legitimate firsts in many ways. They produced the earliest known writing. They were the earliest cities to leave records we can actually read. But they were not, it now appears, the earliest large concentrations of human population living in permanent organized settlements. That distinction, based on current evidence, appears to belong to a civilization that most people in the Western world have never heard of. It existed in what is now eastern Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. It lasted for nearly 3,000 years. From approximately 5,500 BC to 2,750 BC. At its peak, between roughly 4,100 and 3,600 BC. It built settlements that were, by current estimates, among the largest known human settlements of their time anywhere on Earth. We call it, awkwardly, the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, named for two sites where its remains were first identified in the late 19th century. A Romanian folklorist named Teodor Burada noticed ceramic fragments near the village of Cucuteni in 1884. 13 years later, a Ukrainian archaeologist named Vikenty Kvoyka announced a large site near the village of Tripilia. It took decades of further research before anyone understood that these two sites, and thousands of others scattered across the region, belong to the same cultural tradition. What that tradition built is extraordinary. At Talyanki in modern Ukraine, archaeologists, using geophysical survey, alongside traditional excavation, have identified the remains of up to 2,700 structures, arranged in concentric rings, across an area of approximately 450 hectares, over 1,000 acres. Population estimates for this single site range from around 15,000 to as high as 21,000 people. At Maidanitske, archaeomagnetic surveys have mapped approximately 2,300 burned clay structures. At Nebelivka, a site of 238 hectares. Research teams have produced the first complete architectural plan of a mega-settlement in prehistoric Europe. More than 29 Cucuteni Tripilia sites had areas greater than 100 hectares. These were not villages. And here is what makes them genuinely remarkable, in a way that goes beyond their size. There are no palaces. In a settlement of 20,000 people, organized enough to lay out houses in precise concentric rings. Organized enough to sustain a community of that size for generations. There is no structure that stands apart as the residence of a ruler. No building dramatically larger than the others. No complex that announces itself as the seat of authority. The houses across these settlements are, to a striking degree, uniform in size and internal arrangement. No obvious fortifications oriented against external enemies. No weapons, caches. No clear hereditary elite status visible in the burials. The dead were not buried with dramatically different quantities of goods depending on their social position, in the way that hierarchical societies typically arrange their cemeteries. What there is, in extraordinary quantities, is pottery. The ceramics of the Cucuteni Tripilia people are among the most sophisticated of the prehistoric world, decorated with swirling red, black, and white geometric motifs of considerable complexity, fired at temperatures requiring precise control, shaped with a mastery that modern potters attempting to reproduce it with traditional techniques have found genuinely difficult to match. This was not utilitarian production. This was craft at a level that implies dedicated specialists. Long training, and a community that valued the work enough to support the people doing it. There are also, in the tens of thousands, small clay figurines. Most are female in form, though what that means for the social structure of these communities is genuinely contested among researchers. Some are seated, some are standing. Many are decorated with incised geometric designs. Some appear to have been deliberately broken in specific ways, with particular parts separated and deposited in particular locations within the structure. They were clearly not casual objects. They mattered. Every one of them, in the mind of the person who shaped it, was something specific, had a story, had a relationship to the person who made it or the household that kept it. We do not know any of those stories. We do not know a single name. And then there is the fire. Every 60 to 80 years, across site after site, across a span of more than 1,000 years and an enormous territory, the Cucuteni Tripilia people burned their cities to the ground. Not metaphorically, not through enemy attack. The archaeological evidence at Talyanki, at Majdanetske, at Nebelivka, and at dozens of smaller settlements is consistent and clear. The structures were set on fire deliberately. The fires were hot enough to vitrify the clay walls, turning mud brick structures into something approaching ceramic. Experimental archaeology conducted by the AHRC-funded Early Urbanism in Europe project at Nebelivka indicates that, to achieve the temperatures observed in the archaeological record, the inhabitants would likely have had to stack additional fuel inside the structures before lighting them. These were not accidents. And then, on the ashes of the old settlement, sometimes directly on top and sometimes nearby, they built again. The same concentric ring layout, the same inward-facing houses, the same organization of shared central space, and they lived there for another 60 or 80 years, and then they burned it again. This pattern repeated across a region covering hundreds of thousands of square kilometers for more than 1,000 years. It was not a local quirk. It was a cultural practice carried forward by hundreds of generations. Several explanations have been proposed by researchers working directly with the evidence. Some suggest a practical motivation, that after several decades, wooden structures accumulated infestations or structural deterioration severe enough that demolition was simpler than repair. Others propose a ritual dimension, that these communities understood their houses as having finite lifespans and that burning them was a form of dignified closure. Some researchers have connected the burnings to the deaths of significant individuals, to agricultural soil exhaustion, or to periodic reorganizations of social space. Ukrainian archaeologists Natalia Burdo and Mikhailo Videyko have documented multiple phases of smaller-scale ritual burnings of individual houses alongside the massive settlement conflagrations that marked periodic abandonment. The honest answer is that we do not know which explanation is correct. We may never know. The practice is the only testimony we have, and what it testifies to is a relationship with permanence and impermanence that has no real parallel in the traditions of human civilization we have inherited. Every civilization we study has operated under some version of the assumption that what you build to last. The goal of construction is endurance. A structure standing for 1,000 years is a triumph. The Cucuteni Tripilia people appear to have understood building differently. They built with extraordinary care and skill. Their houses were well made. Their pottery was exceptional. Their settlements were organized with deliberate attention to communal space. They were not people who did things carelessly, and they chose, consistently, deliberately, over more than a millennium, to consume what they had built and begin again. Around 2750 BC, the mega-settlement phase ended. The largest concentrations dissolved into smaller communities. Over the following centuries, the Cucuteni Tripilia cultural tradition faded from the archaeological record. The reasons remain debated. Climate change affecting agricultural productivity, soil exhaustion from intensive farming, population movements from the steppes to the east, internal social transformations. All have been proposed, and the evidence does not currently allow a confident conclusion. What is certain is that the mega-settlement phase ended, and that nothing comparable in scale would appear in the region for another 3,000 years. They built for the present. They burned for reasons we cannot fully recover. They rebuilt with the same care they had brought to what they burned. And they did this. And this is the thing worth sitting with as your eyes grow heavy. They did this not once or twice, but as a sustained cultural practice across more than 1,000 years and hundreds of generations. Whatever they understood about the relationship between building and time, between effort and impermanence, between the community of the living and the community that would come after. It was different from what most of us have been taught to assume, and they understood it deeply enough to pass it down, unchanged in its essential pattern, for a span of time longer than the entire history of recorded Western civilization. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what they called the practice. We do not know whether they grieved the burning or celebrated it or felt something that has no name in any language we currently speak. The ash is still in the soil. The outlines of the houses are still readable to instruments, sensitive enough to detect the magnetic signature of vitrified clay buried under centuries of topsoil. The concentric rings of a community that chose impermanence over endurance are still there, if you know how to look. And somewhere in the pattern of those rings, in the deliberate repetition of building and burning and building again, there is a philosophy about how to live in time that we have not yet found the right words for. Let your breathing slow. The ash is patient. It has been waiting under the soil of Ukraine and Romania for 5,000 years, holding the outline of what was built, and what was chosen, and what was lost. Chapter 6. The sound of a language no one can hear. There is a clay tablet in a museum in Heraklion, on the island of Crete. It is small, roughly the size of a large hand. Its surface is covered in lines of small, incised marks, made by a stylus, pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago, before the clay dried and preserved those marks in the form they have held ever since. The marks are writing, real writing, used by real people to record real things that mattered to them. The signs are precise and consistent, the product of trained scribes working within an established tradition. The tablet is one of over 1,000 objects bearing this particular script, recovered from sites across Crete and scattered locations around the eastern Mediterranean. The script is called Linear A. You can learn to read it, not what it says. That distinction matters enormously, and we will come back to it. But you can learn the signs. You can learn the sound values that researchers have derived by comparing Linear A to a related script called Linear B, which was deciphered in 1952 by a young English architect named Michael Ventris, building on the foundational analytical work of the American scholar Alice Kober, who spent years cataloging the statistical behavior of the signs before her early death, leaving behind index cards that Ventris inherited and used to complete what she had begun. Kober identified the patterns. Ventris found the key. Linear B turned out to be Greek, an early form of Greek written centuries before Homer, used by Mycenaean palace administrators to keep records of livestock and grain and textile production. The Mycenaeans had borrowed the linear script from the Minoans, the civilization that preceded them on Crete, and when they adapted it, they kept the phonetic values of many of the signs they reused, which means that many signs in Linear A and Linear B are shared. So, if you take the sound values established for Linear B signs and apply them, approximately and tentatively, to the corresponding signs in Linear A, something happens that feels like it should lead somewhere. You can read a Linear A tablet aloud. You can sit with something inscribed 4,000 years ago by a person whose name you will never know, and produce sounds, real sounds, shaped by a human mouth, corresponding as closely as current research allows to what was written there. You can say the words. What you cannot do is understand them, because the language underneath the signs is not Greek. It is not related to any language in the Indo-European family. It is not Egyptian or Hittite or Akkadian or any Semitic language. It is not related to any language that has ever been identified in any other source. The Minoan language stands alone in the linguistic record, without a single identified relative, without a bilingual inscription that might anchor it to something decodable. The scholars who have spent careers working on Linear A describe the experience of this impasse in ways worth taking seriously. You have the sounds, approximately, tentatively, based on comparisons that may not transfer perfectly. You can produce something, and the meaning is completely, perfectly, permanently absent. As if someone handed you a key that fits the lock exactly, turns in the mechanism, and opens a door onto a wall. We can almost hear the words, almost. And the almost is not a small thing. It is its own particular kind of loss. Not the loss of something you never had. The loss of something you can feel the edge of and cannot reach. Over 1,000 tablets and inscribed objects survive. The texts appear to be primarily administrative. Inventories and receipts and lists. But imagine what they would contain if we could read them. The names of Minoan rulers. The names of their gods. The words they used for the sea that surrounded them on every side. The terms for the bull, which appears so prominently in their art. The language of negotiations that kept peace among the palaces of Crete for 7 centuries. The words for love and grief, and the quality of light on the Aegean in early morning. All of it is on those tablets, sounded out and silent, waiting. And Linear A is not the only case of this particular kind of torment. The Indus Valley script, used across one of the largest and most sophisticated urban civilizations of the ancient world, from roughly 3,300 to approximately 1900 BC, remains undeciphered. Over 4,000 inscribed objects have been recovered, carrying approximately 400 distinct signs. But the inscriptions are heartbreakingly brief. Most contain fewer than 5 signs. The longest known is 26 characters. It is, as one researcher described it, as though we found a library where every book contained only its title. Written in a language no living person speaks. No bilingual inscription exists to anchor the Indus script to any known language. The direction of writing has not been definitively established. The underlying language remains unknown. There is an important distinction worth making clearly here, because popular accounts often blur it in ways that create false expectations. Linear A and the Indus script are not undeciphered in the same way that Linear B was undeciphered before Ventris and Kober. Linear B was undeciphered because no one had yet found the key. The key existed, findable within the script itself and in its relationship to known Greek. And they found it. Linear A and the Indus script face a different problem. The key may not exist anywhere in the surviving record. Without a bilingual text, without a related language to use as a reference point, without descendant languages that preserved some recognizable continuity with the ancient tongue, the signs may remain opaque, regardless of how sophisticated the analytical tools applied to them become. Machine learning algorithms are currently being applied to both scripts. The results so far have been suggestive in some limited respects. Researchers are careful in their public statements about what these methods can and cannot establish. Before 3000 BC, there were almost certainly thousands of distinct languages spoken across the inhabited world, languages with their own grammatical structures, their own poetic traditions, their own ways of organizing how a person experienced being alive. The overwhelming majority of those languages are not merely undocumented. They are gone in a way that leaves no trace. Every language that has ever been spoken was someone's entire world. Not a communication tool. Not a system for encoding information. the medium through which reality itself was organized and experienced and understood, the structure through which every perception was filtered and every relationship was navigated and every memory was stored. When a language dies, that world dies with it. Not the physical world, the world of meaning that the language made possible. We have lost thousands of those worlds, each as complete and internally coherent as the world you inhabit right now. Organized by the language you are hearing these words in. And some of those worlds almost certainly contained words for things we do not have, adequate words for in any language currently spoken. Specific observations, specific qualities of experience that someone, somewhere, considered important enough to name. Things that were known, named, and then lost. The clay tablet in Heraklion is still there. The marks are still precise and clear, exactly as the stylus left them 4,000 years ago. A person made those marks deliberately, pressing each one with care, recording something that mattered to them in a world that was as real as yours. We can almost hear the words, almost. Let your eyes close if they want to. The sounds are still there. In a way, the shapes of the signs still hold the intention of the hands that made them. It is only the meaning that is missing. And the missing meaning is not nothing. It is everything. Chapter 7. Caral and the civilization without clear evidence of war. There is a valley in Peru, about 200 kilometers north of Lima, where the Supe River comes down from the Andes and spreads across a coastal plain before reaching the Pacific. The valley is dry. The hills surrounding it are the color of pale sand. In the midday light, they have a quality of stillness that feels very old, which, it turns out, is appropriate. Because what was built in this valley, beginning around approximately 2600 BC, based on radiocarbon dating of reed bags and other organic materials that the builders used as construction material, is among the oldest urban complexes in the Americas, and among the oldest anywhere on Earth. We call it Caral. The date matters because of what it places Caral alongside. 2600 BC is roughly contemporary with the construction of the Great Pyramid of Khufu in Egypt. It predates the Olmec civilization of Mesoamerica, long considered the mother culture of that region, by more than 1,500 years. It predates the earliest evidence of complex society in most of the Americas by a comparable margin, and it arose, as far as the available evidence indicates, in complete isolation. No contact with any other literate civilization. No borrowing of architectural knowledge from the great building traditions of the Old World. No outside stimulus that researchers have been able to identify. Just a group of people in a dry coastal valley in South America, deciding to build something that had never been built in their part of the world before. Ruth Shady Solis, a Peruvian archaeologist, began the serious systematic study of Caral in 1994. After the site had been briefly noted and largely overlooked by earlier researchers, who found it difficult to date because it lacked the pottery fragments that normally anchor Peruvian archaeological sites to known chronological sequences. The absence of pottery, Shady eventually understood, was not a sign that the site was unimportant. It was a sign that the site was older than pottery in the region. When Shady published her results in the journal Science in April of 2001, the implications attracted immediate international attention. A civilization contemporary with the pyramids of Egypt had existed in South America, entirely independently, and had remained essentially unknown to Western scholarship until the beginning of the 21st century. The urban complex at Caral spreads across more than 150 acres. 6 large pyramidal structures rise above a carefully organized central plaza. The largest of these, known as the Temple Mayor, or the Great Temple, measures nearly 500 feet in length, 360 feet in width, and 92 feet in height. Sunken circular plazas, some large enough to hold hundreds of people, are set into the ground in front of the pyramidal structures. Residential buildings cluster in arrangements that appear to reflect some organization by social function, though the nature of that organization is still being understood as excavation continues. Caral was one of approximately 30 related settlements in the Norte Chico region, a network of sites along the Supe, Pativilca, and Fortaleza rivers that collectively represent what appears to be the oldest known civilization in the Americas, and one of only 6 places on Earth where civilization is believed to have arisen independently, without external stimulus. Now here is the thing that makes Caral genuinely remarkable in a way that goes beyond its age. Across the dozens of sites excavated in the Norte Chico region so far, researchers have found no clear archaeological signatures of warfare, no weapons designed for use against other people, no fortification walls built to keep enemies out, no physical evidence of massacre or violent conflict, no battle sites, no iconography of conquest or military triumph of the kind that appears prominently in the art and architecture of most other early civilizations. It is important to be precise about what this means and what it does not mean. The absence of evidence for warfare is not proof that warfare never occurred. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And archaeologists are appropriately cautious about drawing strong conclusions from what has not been found. Future excavations may yet reveal evidence of conflict that current work has not uncovered. What can be said, based on the evidence currently available, is that the archaeological record of Caral and the related Norte Chico sites does not show the signatures of militarism that are visible in comparable early civilizations elsewhere. The contrast with Mesopotamia, where fortification walls and weapons and iconography of conquest appear relatively early in the urban sequence, is real and significant, even if its precise interpretation remains a matter of scholarly discussion. Ruth Shady, based on decades of work at the site, has proposed that Caral was organized around trade rather than conquest, specifically around the exchange of cotton, which the inland farmers of the Supe Valley produced, and which coastal communities needed to weave the fishing nets that sustained their food supply. A complementary economic relationship between inland and coastal communities, she argues, may have provided the organizational basis for the Norte Chico civilization, without requiring the kind of coercive authority that military power typically represents. This hypothesis is consistent with the evidence. It is a reasonable inference, held by a respected researcher with deep first-hand knowledge of the sites. It should be understood as such, not as a settled conclusion. Inside one of the temples at Caral, Shady's team found 32 flutes made from the bones of condors and pelicans, and 37 cornets made from the bones of deer and llamas. Pause on that for a moment. 32 flutes, made from condor bones, placed deliberately inside a temple. Music appears to have been central to the ritual life of this community in a way that left a physical, recoverable trace. These were not incidental finds. They were deposited with intention, in a context that suggests they were considered important enough to place inside the most significant architectural space the community had built. These were people who gathered, likely by the hundreds, in those large sunken circular plazas, and made sound together, who played instruments of considerable craftsmanship, who considered music important enough to incorporate into the architecture of their most sacred spaces. We do not know what that music sounded like. We do not know what occasions brought people into the plazas to hear it. We know that the flutes were made from condor bones, which tells us something about what the condor meant to these people. Given that the bones of that particular bird were selected for this particular purpose, we know they played. We do not know the songs. And then there is the quipu. Among the objects recovered at Caral is a knotted textile piece that appears to be a quipu, the knotted string recording device that the Inca would use 3,000 years later to manage one of the largest empires in pre-modern history, tracking census data and tribute records and historical narratives through a system of knots and strings that researchers are still working to fully understand. If Shady's identification of the Caral object as a quipu is correct, and the identification has been supported by some researchers, though it has also been questioned, it would make this the oldest known example of this recording technology. Evidence that the Andean tradition of recording information through knotted strings may stretch back to the very beginning of organized society in the region. We cannot read it. We do not know what the knots recorded. A census of the population, a record of the cotton traded and the fish received in exchange, the names of the people buried beneath the plaza, something that does not correspond to any category we would recognize. Something was being recorded. Something was considered important enough that someone spent the time to encode it in a physical object designed to preserve it. We do not know what that something was. Around 1800 BC, after flourishing for more than 800 years, Caral was abandoned. Work published in 2025 by Shady's team has linked the decline to a prolonged drought around 2200 BC, part of what climate scientists call the 4.2 kiloyear event, a global arid episode that disrupted civilizations from Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley during roughly the same period. Excavations at later Norte Chico sites, like Vichama, on the Pacific coast, have uncovered temple friezes depicting what researchers interpret as visual records of famine and drought, stylized images of starving figures, of pregnant women, of large fish representing hoped-for abundance, images made by people who were suffering, who were watching their world change in ways they could not fully control, who tried to record what was happening and what they hoped for in a visual language that their community could read. We can see the images. We cannot read the language. And, in 2024, Shady's team opened Vichama to researchers and visitors for the first time, a site that appears to represent a direct continuation of Caral's architectural and ceremonial traditions, occupied in the centuries after the original city was abandoned. The available evidence does not show a collapse into visible widespread conflict when Caral became unsustainable. The evidence appears to suggest the people relocated, rebuilt. And can you give their architectural knowledge and ceremonial practices with them into new valleys and new trade relationships? The broad pattern is consistent across multiple sites, though the specific interpretation is still being developed as excavation continues. And the influence of what was established at Caral appears to have persisted for a very long time. For the next 4,000 years, every major civilization in the Central Andes, the Chavin, the Moche, the Wari, the Inca, would build stepped pyramids, sunken circular plazas, and platform complexes whose basic spatial forms were laid down at Caral. They did not write their language. We do not know what they called themselves, but the architectural logic they developed, the specific relationship between raised platform and sunken plaza and shared open space, shaped every civilization that came after them in their part of the world. We walk inside their imagination whenever we walk through the ruins of Machu Picchu. We just do not know their names. The flutes are carefully preserved now, in conditions designed to keep them stable. The condor bones that someone selected, and shaped, and played, are still there. The sound they made is not. Let your breathing slow. The valley is quiet tonight. The pyramids are still standing in the dry coastal plain, holding the outline of a civilization that asked different questions than the ones we are used to asking. Questions about cooperation and music and what you choose to record when you have the technology to record something. Questions we cannot fully answer because the people who could answer them left no words behind. Only stones and flutes and the shape of plazas designed for gathering, and the quiet, persistent sense that whatever they knew about how to live together in a place, It was something worth knowing. Chapter 8. The Watchers of the Sky. There is a mourning that happens once a year at a passage tomb on the eastern coast of Ireland. The tomb is called Newgrange. It was built around 3200 BC, making it older than Stonehenge by several centuries and older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by roughly 600 years. It is a large circular mound, about 85 meters in diameter, faced with white quartz cobblestones that would have made it visible from considerable distances across the surrounding landscape when it was new. Inside the mound, a passage, 19 meters long, leads to a central chamber with a corbelled stone roof that has remained waterproof for more than 5,000 years without any mortar. The stones of the passage and chamber are decorated with carved spirals and lozenges and other geometric forms whose meaning we cannot determine, but whose deliberate and consistent execution suggests they were not decorative in any casual sense. Above the entrance to the passage, there is a small opening called a roof box. On the morning of the winter solstice, the rising sun aligns with the roof box and sends a narrow beam of light down the entire length of the passage into the central chamber. For roughly 15 to 17 minutes, the chamber that is in complete darkness for the rest of the year is filled with sunlight. The archaeological consensus holds that this alignment was intentional. The engineering of the roof box is too precise and too specifically oriented to be easily explained as accidental. The people who built Newgrange knew where the sun would rise on the shortest day of the year, and they built a structure that captured that specific moment and held it in a chamber of stone. They did this without written astronomical tables, without telescopes, without any of the formal apparatus of science as we understand it today. They did it with careful observation, accumulated across many generations, encoded finally into stone in a form that would outlast every person who had contributed to the knowledge it contained. Picture someone standing inside that chamber on a winter solstice morning, 5,000 years ago. They have been told about this moment their entire life. Their teacher was told about it by their teacher. The knowledge goes back further than anyone can trace, further than the oldest person in the community can remember being taught. And now they are standing in the darkness of the chamber, waiting, and the light begins. Slowly at first, a brightening at the end of the passage, and then the beam, narrow and precise, traveling the full length of the stone corridor and filling the space around them with a light that will not be here tomorrow and was not here yesterday. The light does what the stones were built to make it do. And in that moment, the knowledge of everyone who contributed to this structure, every person who observed and remembered and taught and eventually shaped these stones into this specific configuration, is present in a room that is full of light. Newgrange is one point in a pattern that appears with striking consistency across an enormous range of cultures and time periods and geographic locations in the prehistoric world. Eden Midra, the temple complex on Malta, built around 3600 BC. The temple entrance lights up the inner chambers at the equinoxes. At Stonehenge, on the Salisbury Plain, the main axis aligns with the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset, an orientation built into the design from the earliest phases of construction, around 3000 BC. At the Göbekli Circle in what is now Germany, a Neolithic enclosure dating to approximately 4900 BC. Two of the gateway openings frame the sunrise and sunset at the winter solstice. And at Nabta Playa, in the Nubian desert, those stone arrangements that Saharan pastoralists constructed around 5000 BC appear, based on the analysis of researchers including Wendorf and Schild, to have included possible alignments with specific stars and with the summer solstice sunrise. The pattern is real. Across cultures with no known contact with each other, across a span of several thousand years. The people of the prehistoric world invested enormous collective effort in structures that tracked the movements of celestial bodies. The question worth sitting with is not simply what they built or how they built it. The question is why they needed to know. Part of the answer is practical. Knowing when the solstices and equinoxes occur is genuinely useful for agricultural communities timing their planting and harvesting cycles. The winter solstice marks the point at which the days begin to lengthen again. And for communities living at high latitudes, where winter could be life-threatening, that knowledge had real survival value. But the practical explanation does not fully account for the scale of the investment. Researchers estimate that Newgrange required an enormous quantity of material to construct, an undertaking representing many thousands of person-hours of sustained collective labor. Stonehenge, in its various phases, represents an investment that researchers estimate at tens of millions of person-hours spread across centuries. You do not need a structure on this scale simply to know when to plant your crops. A simple post in the ground, whose shadow shifts with the seasons, would serve the agricultural purpose adequately. What these structures appear to represent is something more than seasonal timekeeping. They appear to represent a need to make the knowledge permanent, to build it into something that would outlast the person who knew it, that would still be functional after every living person who had contributed to its construction was gone. This is, in a specific sense, one of the earliest durable systems for storing seasonal knowledge that we can identify in the archaeological record. Before writing, before any system of marks on clay or stone that encoded language, the sky itself, and structures built to track it, appear to have functioned as a kind of external memory, a way of holding knowledge outside of human minds, where it could be accessed by anyone who knew how to read it, regardless of whether the people who encoded it were still alive. And the reason this mattered so deeply is not difficult to understand. Once you think about the conditions these communities lived in, oral transmission of knowledge depends on an unbroken chain of teachers and students. If the people who hold a particular piece of knowledge die before they can pass it on, that knowledge is gone. An epidemic, a famine, a winter severe enough to kill the elders before the young have fully learned what they knew. Any of these could break the chain. The knowledge encoded in structures like Newgrange could not be broken in that way. It was in the stones. It would be there the following year, and the year after that, regardless of what happened to the community in between. The people who built these structures were solving a real problem. How do you preserve knowledge across time, in the absence of writing? You build it into something that does not depend on any individual person remaining alive to carry it forward. They understood that knowledge is fragile in a way that stone is not. And they did something about it. What they built was not just a monument. It was an act of care for the future. The sky outside tonight is the same sky they watched. The sun will rise tomorrow, where the geometry of the solar system requires it to rise. The same geometry those ancient watchers calculated with enough precision to build chambers of stone that captured specific moments of light. They did not know you would be here to inherit what they built. But they built it in a way that assumed someone would be. Let your eyes close. Someone is. Chapter 9. The Ones Who Almost Made It. There is a particular kind of grief that does not have a clean name in most languages. It is the grief of the thing that almost happened, the version of events that came right to the edge of being real and then did not become real, for reasons that were not the fault of anyone involved. The path that was clearly being walked and then was closed before it reached its destination. Sometime around 15,000 BC, in the region we now call the Levant, the stretch of land along the eastern Mediterranean coast that includes modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and parts of Syria, a culture appeared that was doing something that had never been done before in any form the archaeological record has captured. They were settling down. Not temporarily, not seasonally, permanently. The culture is called the Natufian, named for the Wadi and Natif Valley in what is now the West Bank, where their remains were first identified in the 1920s by archaeologist Dorothy Garrod. They were hunter-gatherers, people who obtained their food through hunting animals and gathering wild plants rather than through deliberate cultivation. but they were hunter-gatherers who had stopped moving. The Natufians built permanent stone structures, not the temporary shelters of a group passing through a landscape, but actual dwellings with stone foundations and hearths designed for sustained use. They dug storage pits for the wild grain they gathered in quantity. They made specialized sickle blades, carefully shaped flint tools designed specifically for harvesting grass seeds. And researchers examining those blades under microscopy have found a distinctive sheen on the cutting edges called sickle gloss, which results from repeated contact with silica-rich grass stems. They were harvesting wild grains systematically, at scale, with tools designed for exactly that purpose. They buried their dead in elaborate ways. At a site called Hilazon Taktit, in what is now northern Israel, researchers excavating in the early 2000s found the burial of an elderly woman. Her grave contained the remains of 50 tortoises, parts of a wild boar, a golden eagle, a leopard, 2 martens, and the foot of a human being who was not her. The grave had been deliberately sealed with large stones. This was not a casual burial. This was a statement, an act of ritual that required planning and resources and the sustained cooperation of a community around the death of one specific person. These were people with complex beliefs and a sophisticated relationship with the landscape they lived in. Researchers, including Ofer Bar Yosef of Harvard University, whose decades of work on the Levantine Neolithic established much of the foundational understanding of this period, have described the Natufians as a culture that appears to have been approaching the conditions that would eventually produce agriculture, developing organically out of a rich landscape, a settled lifestyle, and the kind of sustained attention to plants and their behavior that comes from watching them closely for a very long time. They were on the threshold, and then something happened that closed it. Around 12,900 years ago, a period scientists call the Younger Dryas began. The name comes from a cold-loving wildflower that spread across Europe during the climatic reversal, appearing in pollen records as a marker of the sudden return of cold conditions. In brief, it was a return to near-glacial conditions after several thousand years of warming. Temperatures dropped sharply. Rainfall patterns shifted. The landscapes that had supported the Natufian settlements became drier and less productive. The cause of the Younger Dryas remains actively debated in earth science. The mainstream explanation involves the disruption of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the system of ocean currents that distributes heat from the tropics toward the higher latitudes. As the North American ice sheet melted during the preceding warming period, it released enormous quantities of fresh water into the North Atlantic, possibly through the catastrophic drainage of a glacial lake called Lake Agassiz, a body of fresh water larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. This influx of fresh water may have disrupted the salinity-driven circulation system, reducing the transfer of heat northward and causing rapid cooling. A rival hypothesis, proposed in 2007 and extensively debated since, suggests the Younger Dryas was triggered or accelerated by a cosmic impact event over the North American ice sheet. A comprehensive review published in 2023 concluded this hypothesis had not converged into a credible, self-consistent explanation. A subsequent analysis of a platinum anomaly in a Greenland ice core suggested the spike was more consistent with volcanic activity than with an instantaneous impact. The scientific community's current consensus leans strongly against the impact hypothesis. Though some researchers continue to examine specific elements of the evidence, what is not debated is the effect on human populations. The Younger Dryas lasted approximately 1,300 years. During that period, the warming trend that had been underway for thousands of years reversed. Conditions in the Levant returned to something approaching full glacial severity. For the Natufian, the consequences were severe. The permanently settled communities that had developed during the preceding warmer period became harder to sustain. The wild grain harvests declined. Archaeological evidence from Natufian sites dating to the Younger Dryas period shows shifts in the material record. Smaller situs, less elaborate architecture, evidence of greater mobility, as communities that had settled down were forced to move again in search of resources. The threshold they had been approaching was pushed back, not by any failure of knowledge or intelligence or social sophistication, simply by the climate becoming, for 1,300 years, too cold and too dry to support the kind of settled abundance that had made that threshold approachable. And here is the particular quality of grief that sits at the center of this chapter. The Natufians did not disappear. Their descendants were still there, in the Levant, on the other side of the Younger Dryas. When the climate finally warmed again, around 11,600 years ago, and when it warmed, things happened quickly, within a few thousand years, in roughly the same region. Agriculture appeared. The deliberate cultivation of wheat and barley and lentils, the domestication of goats and sheep and pigs and cattle, the Neolithic Revolution, the transition to farming that would eventually change the entire trajectory of human civilization on Earth. It happened, just later than it might have. The people who finally crossed that threshold may not have known that an earlier culture had begun the journey and been forced to stop. The knowledge the Natufians had accumulated about wild grains, about the behavior of plants, about managing landscapes for food production, may have survived in some form through the cold years. Or it may have had to be rediscovered, in part or in whole. We do not know. The chain of transmission across the Younger Dryas is not visible in the archaeological record with enough resolution to say confidently what was preserved and what was lost. What we do know is this: the woman buried at Hilazon Tahtit, with her 50 tortoises and her eagle and her carefully sealed stone grave, lived in a world that was on the verge of changing forever. She did not know that a climatic reversal was coming that would push that change back by more than 1,000 years. She did not know that the culture she was part of, with its permanent settlements and its sickle blades and its elaborate burials, was going to be forced to contract before the expansion could resume. She just lived in the world she had. And the world she had was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. A community sophisticated enough to produce her burial was a community with deep knowledge, complex beliefs, and a rich interior life that the objects in her grave can only hint at. Her name is gone. The language she spoke is gone. The stories she told are gone. What remains is the arrangement of stones above her grave, and the bones of 50 tortoises, and the questions those objects ask about what her community believed. Questions that the cold could not erase. Questions that her descendants carried through the Younger Dryas and out the other side, into a warmer world where, finally, after everything, the threshold could be crossed. The grief of the thing that almost happened has a resolution. In this case, it happened, just not when it was going to happen. Let your breathing slow. The Younger Dryas ended. The climate warmed. The wild grains came back. The threshold was approached again, and this time crossed. The world the Natufians were building toward exists now, in a form they could not have imagined. And, somewhere in the foundation of that world, in the accumulated knowledge of how plants behave and how communities can sustain themselves through lean years and plentiful ones, somewhere in all of that, is the work that they did, unnamed, unrecorded, present. Chapter 10. What the Bones Remember. There is a laboratory at Harvard University where the dead speak, not metaphorically, in a more literal sense than that, and a more recent one. In this laboratory, and in others like it around the world, researchers extract genetic material from the teeth and bones of people who died thousands of years ago. Sequence that material with technology that did not exist a generation ago, and read from it a record of human movement and mixture and replacement that no written document could have preserved. The field is called ancient DNA analysis. Think about what that means for a moment. Every person whose bones are in the ground left a record of their existence in the chemistry of their own body. Not a record they chose to leave. Not a record they knew they were leaving. Simply the biological fact of who they were, encoded in the molecular structure of their teeth and the dense inner cortex of their femurs, waiting in the soil for thousands of years for someone to develop the technology to read it. David Reich, who leads the Ancient DNA Laboratory at Harvard Medical School and whose 2018 book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, brought the findings of this research to a broader audience, has described the experience of reading ancient genomic data as similar to gaining access to a completely new kind of historical document, one written by biology rather than by human intention. Recording events its authors did not know they were recording. The technology developed quickly. What seemed impossible in 2000 became difficult in 2010 and routine in 2020. The cost of sequencing ancient genomes dropped by orders of magnitude. The methods for extracting usable genetic material from degraded ancient samples improved dramatically. And what the data revealed, as it accumulated from sites across Europe and Asia and eventually the Americas and Africa, was a picture of the prehistoric world defined far more by movement, mixture, and replacement than older models had assumed. It is worth pausing here to be clear about what ancient DNA can and cannot tell us. It can tell us where a person's ancestors came from. In broad genetic terms, it can trace the movement of populations across landscapes and across generations. It can identify when one genetic profile replaced or mixed with another in a given region. What it cannot tell us is what language those people spoke, what they believed, what stories they told, what they called the world around them. The genetic record is a record of bodies moving through space and time. The inner life, the culture, the meaning. Those things are as invisible to a genome sequencer as they are to any other instrument we possess. The bones remember some things, not everything. And the distance between what the bones remember and what we actually want to know is still vast. With that in mind, here is what the ancient DNA evidence has revealed about the population history of prehistoric Europe. The Neolithic farmers who spread agriculture across Europe beginning around 7000 BC, the people who built the megalithic traditions of Western Europe, whose descendants raised the stones of Newgrange and the long barrows of Britain and the temple complexes of Malta, carried ancestry that traced back to populations in what is now Turkey and the Near East. They were not the original inhabitants of Europe. They had themselves replaced or absorbed the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who preceded them. They carried their knowledge across the continent over 2,000 years. They built things designed to outlast them. And then something happened. Around 3000 BC, a population with ancestry tracing to the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grassland region north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, began moving into Europe in large numbers. These people, whose genetic profile researchers associate with cultures known archaeologically as Yamnaya and related groups, were pastoralists, herders of cattle and horses. Linguists widely believe they spoke languages ancestral to the Indo-European family. The family that today includes English and Spanish and Russian and Hindi and Persian and most of the languages of Europe and South Asia. In Britain, ancient DNA studies have shown that within a few centuries of the arrival of steppe-related ancestry in the archaeological record, the genetic profile of the population had undergone what the technical literature describes as a major genetic turnover. The Neolithic farming populations who had built Stonehenge experienced a substantial shift in ancestry as populations with steppe-related genetic profiles became a dominant component of the gene pool. It is important to be precise about what this means and what it does not mean. The ancient DNA evidence shows a major shift in the genetic ancestry of the population. What it does not do, by itself, is, tell us how that shift happened. Whether through violent conflict, through differential survival during periods of disease or famine, through differential fertility, or through some combination of factors that varied by region and period. The genetic evidence alone cannot determine. What is not in dispute is the scale of the change. The people who built Stonehenge experienced a major shift in ancestry within a few centuries. Their specific genetic legacy was substantially diluted by the movements of populations they did not know were coming and could not have prepared for. Their names are gone. Their language is gone, replaced by the Indo-European languages that the incoming steppe populations brought with them. What remained was the landscape they had shaped, the monuments they had built, the astronomical alignments they had engineered into chambers of stone. All of it inherited by populations who arrived after them, without, as far as the available evidence shows, fully understanding who had built these things or why. They built something that proved more durable than the populations that built it. The bones are in the ground and in the laboratories. And they are talking. In a language of nucleotides and population frequencies and admixture proportions that requires specialized training to read, but speaks nonetheless. It says, we were here. We moved. We mixed. We were replaced. We continued and changed form. It does not say our names. It does not say what we believed or what we feared or what word we used for the feeling of standing inside a stone chamber on the morning of the winter solstice and watching the light come in. But it says we existed. And the distance between those two things, between knowing someone existed and knowing who they were, is the distance this entire story has been trying to cross. Tonight, in whatever quiet place you have found for yourself, sit with that distance for a moment, feel the width of it, and then let it go. Chapter 11. The Unnamed and the Unnameable. There is a distinction worth making carefully tonight, because it sits at the heart of everything this story has been trying to say. It is the distinction between two kinds of silence. The first kind is the silence of things that were once known and have been lost. A language that was spoken and is no longer spoken. A name that was used and is no longer used. A story that was told and is no longer told. This is the silence left by something that was present and is now gone. Real, vast, and recoverable. In fragments. With enough patience and the right tools. The second kind is different. It is the silence of things that were never recorded in the first place. Not lost from a record that once existed. Never entered into any record at all. The interior life of a person who lived 40,000 years ago. Not because the trace was made and then destroyed, but because no system existed that could have made such a trace. The conversation between two people walking across Doggerland 9,000 years ago. A conversation that existed entirely as sound that dissipated in the air the moment it was spoken. This second kind of silence is not the silence of loss in the conventional sense. It is the silence of what was never available to be lost. And it is the more profound silence of the two. Because it does not even leave the shape of an absence behind. It leaves nothing. Not a gap in a record. Not a missing page. Just the fullness of human lives passing through the world without leaving any recoverable external trace of their inner content. This matters because the way we tend to talk about prehistoric peoples can inadvertently suggest that what we are dealing with is primarily a problem of record loss. That if we could find the right artifact, the right inscription, the right ancient DNA sample, we could recover what has been lost and fill in the gaps. But the silence of the unrecorded is not a gap. It is the default condition of human existence across the vast majority of the span of human life on Earth. For the overwhelming majority of the time that modern humans have existed, the inner lives of human beings were entirely private in a way that nothing in the modern world quite replicates. Not private in the sense of being kept secret from other people, but private in the more absolute sense of being inaccessible to any future person. regardless of how much they might want access. Every thought that was thought, every dream that was dreamed, every grief that was felt, every moment of joy, or wonder, or boredom, all of it existed only in the moment it occurred and in the memories of the people present for it. And then, when those people died, it was gone. This is simply what human experience was for most of human history. The people who lived in that condition did not experience it as deprivation. They were living in their present, which was as vivid and as complete and as urgent as any present has ever been. The deprivation is ours. We are the ones who cannot access what they knew and felt and thought. They were not missing anything. We are missing something about them. And this reframing changes what we are actually mourning when we sit with the silence of prehistoric peoples. We are not mourning their poverty. They were not poor in the things that matter most to a life. They had relationships and knowledge and belief and purpose and the experience of being alive in a world rich with meaning. Even if that meaning was organized very differently from the ways we organize it. We are mourning our own limitation, our inability to reach across the gulf of time and hear what they were saying. And the clarity of that distinction changes what kind of hope is appropriate. For the silence of lost records, hope lies in finding more records. And that hope is real and growing. LiDAR scanning is revealing cities hidden under jungle canopy that no previous survey detected. Entire urban landscapes in the Amazon that were invisible to every form of observation that preceded it. Ancient DNA analysis is recovering population histories that no amount of traditional archaeological work could have produced. Multispectral imaging is reading texts scraped off parchment 1,000 years ago in circumstances that seem to guarantee their permanent erasure. Machine learning is being applied to undeciphered scripts, searching for statistical patterns that might finally open Linear A or the Indus script or Rongorongo. Each of these tools is doing something that was impossible a generation ago, and each of them is recovering fragments of the human past that would otherwise have remained permanently inaccessible. But, for the silence of the unrecordable, no tool will give us what we are mourning, because it was never there to find. The appropriate response to that is not more research. It is a kind of humility, a willingness to acknowledge that the human past is larger than the human record, that the billions of people who lived before writing was invented were as fully human as any person who has ever left a trace in a historical document, and that their full humanity is, in a deep and permanent sense, beyond our reach. The people we have been talking about tonight were not proto-human, not primitive versions of something that would eventually become us, fully, completely, urgently human, with the same capacity for experience, for thought, for feeling, for meaning-making, that any person alive today possesses. And we will never know most of what they knew, or thought, or felt. That is not a failure of archaeology, or technology, or imagination. It is the condition of the human past. Let that settle, not as defeat, as honesty, and let the honesty open into something else. Into the recognition that every fragment we do recover matters more, not less, because of the scale of what we cannot recover. The hammerstone on the seafloor, the 50 tortoises in the sealed grave, the condor bone flute in the Peruvian temple, the solstice beam in the Irish stone chamber. Each of these is not a footnote. Each is a window, small, partial, smudged at the edges, but open. The unnamed and the unnameable are not the same category. The unnamed can sometimes, with enough patience and technology and luck, be given back a fragment of the recognition they were always owed. The unnameable asks only for the honesty of acknowledging that it exists, that the silence is not empty, that the people who lived inside it were real, and mattered, and were as completely alive as anyone who has ever left a name behind. That is the least we can do, and it is, in its own way, everything. Chapter 12. The Map Beneath the Map. Somewhere tonight. In a building, in a city you may or may not have visited. A machine is running. Quietly. Processing data that took years to collect and months to prepare. The data came from sediment cores, drilled out of the floor of the North Sea, or from the teeth of a person buried in a field in Romania 4,000 years ago, or from the surface of a clay tablet inscribed in a script that no living person can read. And the machine is doing something that would have been impossible a generation ago. It is reading the past. Not all of it. Not even most of it. A fragment. A thread. A small piece of a picture whose full extent no one alive has ever seen. But the thread is real. And it connects to something. We have traveled a long way tonight. From the stone enclosures of Göbekli Tepe to the painted caves of the Sahara, from the drowned country under the North Sea to the burning cities of prehistoric Ukraine, from the silent tablets of Linear A to the condor-bone flutes of Caral, from the winter solstice chamber at Newgrange to the bones of a Natufian woman buried with 50 tortoises in a cave in what is now northern Israel. We have not solved anything. There are no tidy conclusions available for any of these stories. And anyone who offers you one is offering the comfort of a false certainty that the evidence does not support. What we have done is something different. We have stood at the edge of several silences and looked into them long enough to understand that they are not empty. That behind each gap in the historical record is not an absence of people, but a presence of people whose record did not survive. People who were as completely and urgently alive as you are in this moment, whose lives were as complex and as full of meaning and as deserving of remembrance as any person who has ever left a name behind, and whose names are gone so completely that we will never recover them. The map of the world that most of us carry in our minds, the map of human history as we were taught it, begins somewhere around 5,000 years ago with the first cities and the first writing systems and the first recognizable civilizations of the kind that left records we can read. But underneath that map, there is another map. A map of the drowned countries and the burned cities, and the silent tablets, and the stone alignments, and the painted caves, and the languages that died without descendants, and the people who built things that outlasted them by thousands of years, without knowing they were building monuments. A map of the world that was real before the world we know became possible. That map is still being drawn. At excavation sites in Turkey and Peru and Ukraine and the bottom of the North Sea and the depths of the Amazon rainforest, in laboratories where ancient genomes are being sequenced and sedimentary DNA is being extracted from mud and multispectral imaging is recovering words from parchment scraped clean 1,000 years ago. The map is incomplete, and it will always be incomplete. The scale of what has been lost is too great, and the tools for recovery, however extraordinary, are not equal to the task of recovering everything. But it is more complete than it was 10 years ago. And 10 years from now, it will be more complete than it is tonight. And what it shows, in greater resolution with each passing year, is that the story of humanity is longer and stranger and richer and more various than any version of it that has yet been told. There were cities in prehistoric Ukraine whose architects chose impermanence and built it into every structure they raised. There were pastoralists in the Sahara who mapped the sky before the Egyptians built a single pyramid. There were people in coastal Peru who organized a civilization around music and trade, and whose architectural imagination shaped every great culture that came after them in their part of the world. There were communities in a country now under the North Sea who watched their homelands sink beneath the water over the course of generations and found ways to carry what mattered forward into the world that came after. These are not footnotes. They are the story, the one that most of the history we were taught obscures. Not through any deliberate deception, but simply because the records that survived skew toward the recent and the literate and the powerful. And the things that were lost skew toward the ancient and the oral and the ordinary. The ordinary is not less important than the extraordinary. The person who lived and died without leaving a name is not less important than the person whose name is still spoken thousands of years after their death. They are equally human, and the recognition of that equality, the insistence on it in the face of a historical record that implies otherwise, is one of the things that makes the work of recovering the prehistoric past matter beyond the satisfaction of solving puzzles. It says something about us. It says that we are a species that refuses, at our best, to accept that the boundary of the historical record is the boundary of what deserves to be remembered, that we will deploy our finest technologies and our most patient scholarship in the service of recovering a fragment of the life of someone who died 10,000 years ago and left behind nothing but a hammerstone on the floor of the North. See, that we will lie awake with the question of what a linear A tablet actually says, knowing we may never have the answer, because the question matters even without a resolution. That is not a small thing about us. It is one of the better things. And now, as the night deepens around you and your breathing slows towards sleep, I want to leave you with a single image. Not an argument. Not a conclusion. An image. A young archaeologist is kneeling in the dirt at a site whose name most people have never heard. Somewhere in Turkey, or Peru, or Ukraine, or the edge of what was once the Saharan grassland. The light is early morning light, low and warm, and it catches the dust she raises as she works with a soft brush, clearing soil from the edge of something that has not been seen in 5,000 years. She does not know yet what it is. She knows only that it is there, emerging from the ground under the careful work of her hands, and that, whatever it turns out to be, it was put there by someone who existed, who was real, who mattered, who built something, or made something, or placed something in the earth without knowing that it would still be there 5,000 years later, waiting for someone to come looking, with the patience and the care and the willingness to believe that it mattered. Someone came looking. She is kneeling in the dirt right now, and the thing is emerging from the ground, slowly, the way everything important emerges. The past is patient. It has been patient for a very long time, and it is still there, under the ground, and under the water, and under the sand, holding what it holds, holding it for anyone willing to ask the right questions in the right places with the right kind of care. The map beneath the map is still being drawn, tonight, as it is every night. And the people it is a map of, the unnamed, the unrecorded, the ones who disappeared from every census and every record and every map before 3000 BC. They are not gone in the way that gone usually means. They are in the bones. They are in the stones. They are in the ash that is still readable to the right instruments and the shapes of rivers that no longer run above the surface of the land. And they are here, in this story that someone thought to tell, and that you chose to listen to, in whatever room or bed or quiet place you have found for yourself as the night deepens. They are here because you are listening. And listening, it turns out, is how the silence breaks. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. Let your eyes close. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm. The past is still being found, and the people who lived in the long silence before the world learned to write their names are not. Tonight, entirely without witness. Sleep well. Good night.